Hi, welcome to Chapter 6 of Business and Finance. Chapter 6, reasonably short. We're going to get to grips with financial information. So what is financial information? Who uses financial information? Where do we get it from? What makes good information? What makes bad information? All these things that are going to come together to give us a good indication of what this beast that is financial information. So kind of a lot of the stuff that you do at work will go into this area. First thing we've got then is the standard, why is business finance important? And to answer that, really, you need to consider that most of our stakeholders are going to have finance at stake. So obviously shareholders and lenders, but also employees. Think about our customers, our suppliers. And the fact that they have this finance at stake means that business finance is vitally important. We know already from chapter 1 that the primary objective of a business is still to increase shareholder wealth, but we've also seen in chapter 5 there that we see lots of financial risk that can kind of jeopardize the business as a whole. Okay, so let's think about why we need financial information. So what do we use it for? We've got 5 different reasons here. First of all, planning. So think about when your business puts together a budget or puts together a forecast. You really need to know what you're going to be basing that on. So for example, if I'm going to put together a budget for my car factory, what financial information would I need to use? Well, probably how many units I sold last year, probably what the size of the market is likely to be next year, and I'd get both of those pieces of information from very different sources. Probably the number of cars sold last year I could get internally, but perhaps I need to go external to some sort of industry expert to estimate what the size of the market in total will be for the next 12 months. Once I've got my budget for the period, we're going to come on to controlling then. So controlling is all about seeing, well, how am I actually performing against those budgets? So not only am I going to have the budget document, but also details of actual transactions. Maybe I could perform some sort of variance analysis on those. We also need to record transactions. So if I want to make sure I've recorded all of my sales, I need to make sure I have all of my sales invoices. Performance measurement. Now obviously these can be financial, how we're performing financially, but also when we come on to look at chapter number 7, we'll consider non-financial performance measures. And that could include, things like, well, how many complaints have I had? How many breakdowns has the machine had? How many returns have I had of my product that somebody wants a warranty claim or wants a refund for? And then finally, decision making. So if you imagine in my car factory, we are launching a new car. What I might do is put together a net present value calculation. That net present value is going to enable me to say, yes, I want to do this project, or no, I do not want. And there's lots and lots of bits and pieces that will go in there that we're going to need to find the information for. So for example, what do I think inflation is going to be over the next 5-6 years, however long I'm expecting this model to last for? What do I think likely labor costs are going to be? What do I think the taxation is going to be over that period? So all of these things I can find out somewhere. Now we're going to consider shortly what makes good information. So I'm not saying that all of this is going to be perfect. We know by nature a plan is bound to be wrong, is bound to be somewhat inaccurate. So we do need to consider what makes good information at some point too. Okay, now obviously this being business and finance, we love to categorize things, and we've got 4 more here. So we can take that idea of financial information or information generally, and we can categorize that into these 4 areas. So planning information is going to be any sort of information that helps me with my planning process. So we've discussed already things like a market expert's estimate of the size of the market, or how many units I sold last year, or how many units I sold in the second half of last year, or how many units I sold when the weather was good, or how many units I sold when the weather was bad. All of this information is going to help me to plan for the future. Operational information is going to be able to cover my day-to-day activities. So the example we've got here is how many operatives are needed on one shift. So if I know that For example, in my car factory, I have to have one supervisor for every five kind of production employees. Then I need that information to know how many supervisors to hire. Tactical information will give me some sort of help to deal with short-term issues. So for example, I might put together my monthly variance report to see where I've gone wrong that month. Whereas strategic information will support longer term. So do I have the resources available to expand my production in the long term? Okay. Section 3 then, as I said, we're going to come on to thinking about qualities of good information. So these are just a few things that you need to consider before you decide, yes, this is good information for me to use. And we use the phrase here, accurate, to remember these. So it's a nice way for you to remember if you remember accurate. We'll give you the qualities of good information that will help you to kind of remember it for the exam. So let's imagine then that I've been brought a report. I've been brought, let's say for example, a report or a net present value calculation, so a project appraisal document on the new model of car that I'm going to launch. Let's run down these different criteria then, or these different characteristics of good information, and see what we really mean. So first of all, we've got accurate. Now, when you're talking about something like a project appraisal technique like net present value, when you say accurate, you're really just saying accurate enough. So it has to be accurate enough to be useful. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate. That kind of goes hand in hand with timely. So sometimes it's more important to have information on time than it is to be 100% accurate. Other times, like with financial accounts or financial statements, they have to be accurate rather than timely. They have to be complete. So let's think about my car net present value appraisal. There has to be all of the information that I'm going to need to make my decision. So for example, if they've put all of the revenues into my calculation but they haven't put any of the costs in, that's obviously not going to help me make my decision. Cost beneficial is just talking about weighing up the cost of producing the information versus the kind of benefit that you get from it. So if the total profit that I'm going to make on my cars is, I don't know, $1 million, and it cost me $1.1 million to put this calculation together, then obviously that's not a very good business decision. It has to be user targeted, so depending on who the information is for, it has to be at that level. So if you're giving it to somebody in a more senior position, or maybe they don't need as much detail. If you're giving it to somebody a bit lower down, maybe you need to kind of give a bit more information around each subject. Relevant is hopefully an obvious one, so it has to be relevant to, for example, to the decision that I'm making. Authoritative, so it has to be trustworthy, and we'll think about that in a bit more detail after the next example. Timely we've discussed, so I need the information in time to make whatever decision I'm going to be making. And then finally, easy to use. I want to be able to see all the information that I need quite quickly. I don't want to have to go hunting around, and you might find that use of visuals is quite good here. So some sort of graphic or sound in order to help me to use the information correctly. Okay, that leads on to interactive question 1 then, so the first interactive question for chapter 6. Let's have a look. Managers often complain that they are weighed down by information which they struggle to make sense of and struggle to use. Which of the accurate qualities of good information are most often ignored in information given to managers? Now, what I want you to do then, as always, have a read through the question again. Now, I've highlighted some key areas here, so the things that they're actually complaining about. Maybe you can use those then to match them up with the qualities of good information and see which ones you think they're complaining about the absence of. At this point then, if you just pause the recording, jot down a few ideas, just 2 or 3 ideas is fine, and then once you've had a go at it, click play again and we'll pick up and have a chat through together. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at that. Let's think now together at what we can come up with for some ideas here. I think the fact that they're weighed down by information potentially suggests that there's too much. So maybe the issue is that one of the things that they are not considering is only providing relevant information. So that's probably the first of the accurate qualities that I would put down. Secondly, they say it's not very easy to use, so that's a nice easy one. Obviously not considering the ease of use. Struggling to make sense of could be to do with a lack of kind of user focus. So maybe they're not considering who's actually using this information. So perhaps it's not quite in detail enough. And I guess the fact that it's just generally pretty hard to use might be a reason, or might mean that they're perhaps not providing things on time. But those are just generally the kind of things that scenario suggests. So hopefully you got at least a couple of those. Following on in the same vein, then 3.1 starts to talk about what makes information valuable, and 3.2 goes on to just re-emphasize then this issue around the cost of collecting the data. So what does make information more valuable? So certainly certain sources will be more valuable. Often we think about getting information from from an external source like the internet, and often anyone can post anything on the internet. So it's not necessarily the most trustworthy, for example. Ease of assimilation. So often the problem with information is that it's not very quick to understand. Using things like graphics and sound and different colors and graphs and charts and so on can often speed that process up, so they just enrich the experience of using the information. Accessibility is obviously very important. So if you can make something easily accessible, so for example putting it on the internet, that's obviously much more valuable then to people. And then finally, relevance, the actual content of what we're providing or what we're using has to be relevant to what we're trying to use it for. Finally then, for that section, 3.2 just talks over the costs and the value. So similar to the example I used earlier, if you've got a piece of information that leads to an increase in profit of £90, but the information costs £100 to collect, that's obviously not very good for us. Okay, we'll just look at section 4 before we finish for this recording, and then we'll pick up with section 5 on the next recording. Section 4 is looking at the different sources that we have. So whilst we've been talking, I have mentioned a couple of times there, for example, this internal source or this external source, and we'll come on to that in a second. Before then, just a few little bits of definition we need to remember. So first of all, we've been talking about data and information a lot. What do we mean by data and information? Probably the best thing to remember with data is just think about raw data. So data tends to be distinct pieces of information that we can store, that we can use. Okay, information then is what we get when we start to process that data. So it's much more processed. So that's the key there with information. So I take some data, I use a system to process the data, and the output then is the information. So taking data and then turning it into, for example, a management information report. The database then is just where we store the data. So this is a structured collection, so it's organized, it's usable, of data that is stored on a computer system, along with rules as to the information that will be sought from it. So I can put in a few parameters and it will bring me data based on those parameters. So it's organized. Now, as I said, information can be sought from an internal source or an external source. What we'll do is we'll just have a look through a few of these different examples, but then we'll also consider what makes, what's good about using an internal source, and perhaps what's good about using an external source. So we'll think about the usability and the kind of real life aspect of it too. So let's stick with internal sources to start with. That could be, for example, any sort of output from one of my systems. Now that could be, as an example, my accounting system. So any information that comes from my accounting system would be an example of internal sources of information. So for example, the sales for the last period. It could be informal communications between managers and staff, so just informal communication at any level, really. So we're not talking, through an official memo or anything like that. And then communication between managers. So again, that might be on perhaps a group of employees that are working particularly well that day, or maybe the conditions that they're working in are pretty poor or something like that. We do have a few specific examples here. Now, you could potentially be given some information, or some of these sources, and asked in the exam whether they are an internal or an external source. So make sure you've had a good look over them at some point. We're just going to pick up a couple of them here. We've dealt with the accounting records already, but also things like human resources and payroll records. When I'm putting together my project appraisal for my new car, I need to know how much I'm going to have to pay the workers. Also, I'm going to have to think about what machines I'm going to need to use and how productive they are, so I could look at the current productivity of the machines. What's good about internal sources of information then? Certainly you'd expect them to be pretty cheap, and you'd expect them to be pretty quick. So it wouldn't take me very long here at First Intuition to run downstairs into the office and pull off the details of last period's ICAEW business and finance students, for example. Also likely to be more specific. So I know that the information I look at is going to be specific to our business. I suppose the difference, or the difficulty with that, is you might find that it's a bit too narrow in terms of its scope. Yes, it's specific to our business, but at the same time that can be a drawback because I'm not considering everything else. Let's have a look then at external sources of finance. So for example, we might have some information about changes in tax law. I might have some information about new legislation around health and safety at work. Lots and lots and lots of information is going to have to be from an external source purely because of its nature. Also, think about all the information that you're picking up just generally. Even when it's not specifically targeted, you're just going into a meeting or you're watching television or anything like that, you're picking up information constantly. So for example, you could have seen a news story the previous night. I saw a news story this week about certain European cities trying to ban diesel cars because of the emissions. So when I'm thinking about my car that I'm going to make, I'd have that piece of information that I've gathered from an external source. What's good about external information then, or external sources? Certainly there's more available. So the fact that I can go to lots and lots of different sources and I can gather information about lots and lots of different businesses and companies and industries means that the volume is there. However, there is the question around reliability. Okay, so not always, but you would need to be very careful about the source of the information that you are using. Okay, finally then for section 4, we've got this idea of big data. Now we're seeing the increase of this term big data in lots and lots of the material and the courses that we're running here at First Intuition. So the focus is certainly there. Now big data can refer to two things. It can refer to the actual data itself. So we're going to have a look at the 3 characteristics of big data, but also it can refer to the system and the methods that we actually use to process the data itself. Okay, so when we're talking about big data, we always think about the 3 V's. We think about volume, we think about velocity, and we think about variety. Now, data has been available in one form or another to businesses for years and years and years and years. So we need to think about what makes the data that's available today different to that. And the 3 V's are hopefully going to enable us to do that. Okay, so firstly, volume. Let's take supermarkets. Sainsbury's, for example, would have so much volume available to it that it would never have had in previous years. So for example, let's think about what they have. Well, they obviously have the day-to-day transactions through the till system. So let's say in-store. They have information about online sales. They have information about sales made through their interactive app. They have information coming from Nectar. They have information that is posted to social media. They have information that's posted to traditional written media. Okay, so lots and lots and lots of information. If you think about the amount of transactions that just go through a single till in a Sainsbury's store, that would be a huge and huge amount. Velocity is talking about how quickly this data arrives. So previously, in years gone by, I would imagine that in order to see how a Sainsbury's store had performed, you'd have to wait until the end of the day. You'd have to perform some sort of end-of-day procedure on all of the tills. Now, you could go into Sainsbury's and find real-time transactions. So you could find minute-by-minute transactions. Also think about how quickly the fact that people have mobile phones, how quickly that kind of social media feedback can arrive. People putting on Twitter that they've just been in Sainsbury's and it was so busy, why don't they open more tills, something like that. And this data is real time. It's coming right now, so you can't wait a week or even a day to process it. Finally, then the third V is variety, and we've kind of covered that in the volume section. So not only are we just looking at the traditional forms like transactions or what my competitors are selling, I'm also thinking about social media. I'm thinking probably not for Sainsbury's, but things like TripAdvisor, all of these kind of review sites that pop up that people can look at immediately, and businesses really need to stay on top of that sort of thing. So that's big data. That's the end of this recording. Next, we're going to look at how information is processed. So we've got lots of systems we need to learn, and we're going to have a nice look at an example from the medical profession to try and piece all of these things together. Okay.